So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-five. So this is the second session on this book, and we'll just carry on from where we left last time. So this should be on the screen. We're still looking at chapter 1, which is, it sets the stage for the whole book to follow, so it's worth spending some time. And then we'll move on to the a critical essay on this book, just to have a widespread, comprehensive coverage of what this novel is all about. Now, we're still talking about, we're still looking at the writerly process, the writerly experimental process through which, the whole idea of Dresden bombing is sort of condensed together into a narrative, and how that becomes, how that emerges into some kind of a narrative shape with which the novel is executed. And we find that, this constant play between the profound and the flippant is what makes this novel very carnivalesque in quality, pseudo-comical in quality, and also postmodernist in quality. Now, see how he defines himself, Vonnegut, as a writer. He's someone who's struggling to produce his memory into an act of fiction. And this is what he says, and this should be on his screen. As a trafficker in climaxes and thrills and characterization and wonderful dialogue and suspense and confrontations, I'd outlined the Dresden story many times, right? So, climaxes and thrills and characterizations and dialogue writing and confrontation. I mean, these are supposed to be the forte of the writer, the fiction writer. So he had outlined the Dresden story many times, apparently. But look at the anticlimactic quality right after that, the very next sentence, where he says, the best outliner ever made, or anyway, the prettiest one, was on the back of a roll of wallpaper, right? And this is what I meant when I said there's this constant play of profundity, interplay of profundity and flippancy. So the wallpaper, the back of the wallpaper, seems to be the most suitable form, seems to be the most suitable site of laying out the the characterizations, laying out the dialogues, laying out the suspenses, right? So this whole idea of writing on the back of something, something seemingly unacademic, something seemingly non-literary, is a reflection on this particular book per se, because this book is all about the mundane and the profound, the material and the spiritual, and all these are combined together in this traumatized mind, which doesn't quite get around to telling the story about trauma, which doesn't quite get around to writing the narrative about trauma, or writing the memory about trauma. So that never really sets off, that never really starts. So he confesses as a writer this is a failed project, right? And that failure to narrate, the failure to recount and put into a narrative shape what exactly happened in Dresden is something which obviously emerges from his survivor's guilt, as well as from his own frustration and existential despair as a writer and as a former soldier. I use my daughter's crayons, a different color for each main character. So again, look at the oddity of the whole enterprise. He's using his daughter's crayon pencils to write about his characters, and each character will have a different color. One end of the wallpaper was the beginning of the story, and the other end was the end. And then there was all the middle part, which was the middle. And the blue line met the red line, and then the yellow line, and the yellow line stopped because the character represented by the yellow line was dead, and so on. The destruction of Dresden was represented by a vertical band of orange cross-hatching, and all the lines that were still alive passed through it, came out the other side. So there is that sort of shape-like quality, this pattern of representation instead of words. And it's almost like a childlike representation. We're using different kinds of colors to talk about different sentiments. So one line represents one sentiment, another line represents some sentiments. The lines crisscross, mix and match, and the colors mix and match too, because the sentiments and emotions are quite varied and quite diverse in quality. So what it shows us at a very sort of structural, constructive level, the level of constructedness, is how the act of memory, the act of remembering, especially in an effort to put that into fiction, is a random process, is a sentimental process, is a biased process, and is an uncertain process. And you often rely on imagination, often rely on the randomness principle in order to represent what we suffered, what we experienced. And that randomness principle is very much there. throughout the novel, right? And to talk about something like Dresden bombing using crayons, that incompatibility, the incongruence is exactly the point. It's a very incongruent form of representation. That you're talking about heavy bombing, talking about a deep, dark tragedy, a very human level, which caused the loss of so many lives. And yet, when you're representing it using your daughter's crayons, we're mixing up colors, different kinds of colors, to talk about that devastating tragedy. And that oddity is exactly that cognitive oddity, that artistic oddity, that representative oddity is exactly what gives this unique dimension to this novel, the dimension of depthlessness, the dimension of tragic comedy, which is actually more tragic, the dimension of uncertainty, which is always there as a sort of spectral condition. Right. The end, where all the lines stopped, was a beet field on the Elbe outside of Halle. The rain was coming down. The war in Europe had been over for a couple of weeks. We are formed in ranks with Russian soldiers guarding us, Englishmen, Americans, Dutchmen, Belgians, Frenchmen, Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians. So thousands of them about to become prisoners of war. And that sort of shows how this war is a global conflict where it doesn't really respect a division, where again the difference between foe and friend is just very slippery and very immutable. And on the other side of the field were thousands of Russians and Poles and Yugoslavians and so on, guarded by American soldiers. An exchange was made there, and the rain 1-for-1. So it's a very mechanical process where either side were releasing the prisoners and making them exchange in in the rain. There was heavy rain, and that exchange was taking place at that time. So you can see how it almost has a cinematic visual quality to it. Vonnegut's descriptions. O'Hara and I climbed into the back of an American truck with a lot of others. O'Hara didn't have any souvenirs. Almost everybody else did. I had a ceremonial Luftwaffe saber. I still do. The rabid little American I called Paul Lazaro in his book had about a quart of diamonds and emeralds and rubies and so on. He had taken those from dead people and the cellars of Dresden. So it goes, right? So these are prisoners of war, and when they're coming back, they have souvenirs. So we have someone called Lazaro. He had sort of stolen jewels from people who are dead in the Dresden cellar where they were held as prisoners, and now they're about to come back to America. So this is the the kind of exchange that's taking place at the time. An idiotic Englishman who had lost all his teeth somewhere had a souvenir in a canvas bag. The bag was resting on my insteps. He would peek into the bag every now and then, and he would roll his eyes and swivel his scrawny neck, trying to catch people looking covetously at this bag. And he would bounce the bag onto my insteps. I thought his bouncing was accidental, but I was mistaken. He had to show somebody what was in the bag, and he had decided he could trust me. He caught my eye, winked, opened the bag. There was a plaster model of the Eiffel Tower in there. It was painted gold. It had a clock in it. There's a smashing thing, he said. Now, the reason why I chose to read this bit at the opening is you can see how the war creates violence at so many levels. There's, of course, the physical violence. People are dying and losing their loved ones, but also people losing their humanity and just becoming thieves, looting other people's property, and it's a complete anarchy out there. So there's a difference between humans and animals beginning to disappear, and everyone's stealing things from everyone else, and just going back with as much objects that they can steal. So the whole enterprise of war becomes an unglamorous, unheroic enterprise where theft becomes the norm. Theft becomes a grand narrative, and that is the again a very interesting entangled condition between tragedy and thievery, between tragedy and pettiness, between horror and grief, and this trivial pursuits of material possessions, trivial thefts. So this pettiness of war, the tragedy of war, they all mingle together to create this constant notion of constant experience of uncertainty, which is what informs the war. So we'll just skip a little bit now, and then I'll talk about this, what happened subsequently, as Vonnegut goes on to describe. I think about my education sometimes. I went to the University of Chicago for a while. after the Second World War. I was a student in the Department of Anthropology. At that time, they were teaching that there was absolutely no difference between anybody. They must be teaching that still. Another thing they taught was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, you know, we never wrote a story with a villain in it. I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war. Now, you know, there's a reason why we're looking at this. And, you know, education after the war, post-war education becomes very interesting, sort of paradigm shift. And he confesses, describes, Vonnegut describes how he went to a college, University of Chicago, and then he went to the Department of Anthropology, and there, there was, this liberal education which talked about how everyone's equal, how everyone's just, equally, good or bad, how there's no dualism, and how everyone is equally vulnerable to wickedness, or equally vulnerable to greed, to violence, and that is a leveling mechanism that was instructed to them. Now, what that does at a very writerly level is that his shaping of his writerly imagination begins to get informed with his education, and he talks about his dying father, father before he died. He told Vonnegut that he never wrote a story with a villain in it. And he said his response was because he learned that from college after the war, that there's no villain as such. Everyone's wicked, everyone's good in different degrees, and everyone's just grey. And this complex greyness of human character, this complex greyness of human nature, is what is revealed and highlighted at a spectacular level by the war. Because the war reveals there are no good guys or bad guys. That everyone's vulnerable, everyone's a victim in the war, and there are no winners. Everyone loses in different degrees. Some people lose more directly, some people lose more instantly or immediately, and others just stay back to survive that guilt, that trauma, that devastation. So the lack of villain is a very conspicuous absence, and that's something which we see even in this novel. There's no grand villain, there's no blaming of Hitler, there's no blaming of any individual for any war, but rather what is shown in a very clear way, and also in a very symbolic way, especially when it comes to Vietnam, is the machinery of war, and how that almost becomes an automatic process of destruction and violence, where everyone becomes complicit, everyone becomes vulnerable. So this merge between the vulnerable sufferers and the perpetrators, and the perpetrators are also sufferers are also perpetrators, and that merge begins to reflect this automatic condition of war, this sort of machinery of war, which is cannibalistic in quality, which is almost carnivorous in quality, almost automatic in quality, and that takes away agency, at a certain level. After the war starts, after the war is executed, it just becomes an automatic process of an autopilot and mode of destruction, and that's something he experiences at a very close level, at a very great proximity from his own experience in the war. Okay. Right, and then he goes on to talk about his experiences post-war. Right, and it talks about, in this section that we will see now, it talks about how the Dresden air raid, the bombing of Dresden, was not really a very well-known phenomenon in American popular culture, and he wanted to cash in on that. And it goes on to say, even then, I was supposedly writing a book about Dresden. It wasn't a famous air raid back then in America. Not many Americans knew how much worse it had been how much worse it had been than Hiroshima, for instance. I didn't know it either. There hadn't been much publicity. And look at the irony and humor in that, sort of dark humor. I mean, he was imprisoned in Dresden, but he didn't know about the Dresden bombing because he didn't suffer it, and he was just released after the war. But he knew it much later, that this was far worse than Hiroshima. And everyone talks about Hiroshima, everyone talks about the devastating effect on the atomic explosion in Hiroshima and how that continues even to this day. But there's hardly any conversation or any public discourse about how the Americans bombed Dresden. And that sort of goes on to show the bias that informs history writing, the bias that informs memory and remembrance of an event, where the Allied forces, which won the war, because they won the war, the violence wrought by them, the violence perpetrated by them, seemed to be sort of paler in significance, seemed to be less tragic, seem to be less devastating than the violence of the Axis forces, the other forces, right? And also look at the relativity of violence over here, because the Hiroshima bombing gets more attention. The Hiroshima bombing gets more international attention in terms of the people got killed and the devastating effect on humanity. But the Dresden bombing, which according to Vonnegut was worse, it seems to be less important, right? So that there is also this racial undertone to it, right? So it's white people bombing white people, so that just becomes something that ought not to be discussed. Whereas the Japanese bombing, in Japan, in Hiroshima, it just becomes more of a dualistic thing, more of a binary thing, which gets sort of spun into the good versus evil narrative, right? So, but the point being that not all events of the war are remembered equally. So some events are forgotten, conveniently forgotten, and some events are represented and remembered over and over again. And the irony and the humor in this bit is he was there, Vonnegut was there in Dresden when the Dresden bombing happened, but even then he says, I did not know it either, because he was obviously a prisoner. There hadn't been much publicity. I happened to tell a University of Chicago professor at a cocktail party about the raid as I had seen it, about the book I would write. He was a member of a thing called the Committee on Social Thought, and he told me about the concentration camps and about how the Germans had made soap and candles out of the fat of the dead Jews and so on. All I could say was, I know, right? So again, look at the shift of narrative over here, right? So he is a professor of, University of Chicago, presumably a very learned person. But look at the bias of remembrance. The moment he talks about, Vonnegut talks about the Americans bombing Dresden, the narrative shifts to a concentration camp and the horrors of concentration camp and how the Germans, killed Jews and converted their bodies into commodities, etc. So in other words, the Dresden bombing is entirely hushed up, is entirely made invisible, is entirely unremembered and sort of dismembered from public imagination, from public memory. Right, okay, so, and then we come to the end of chapter 1, and we move on quickly to chapter 2 after this, and we find again how the sense of being a failure comes back in Vonnegut's mind, and he talks about how he's going to start writing the book. And he says, this should be on the screen, people aren't supposed to look back. I'm certainly not going to do it anymore. I've finished my war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one is a failure, and had to be, since it was written by a pillar of salt. It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. It ends like this. Poor tea wheat, right? So, and this is the metafictional quality about this novel. He talks about the first line, and then the first line will come in the second chapter. So the second chapter is the first chapter in the novel. The first chapter is the process of writing the novel. So we can see how postmodern it is immediately. Now, what it does at a very fundamental level is it talks about it foregrounds the act of writing, it foregrounds the ritual of writing, the exercise of writing, the machinery of writing. And in the process, it talks about the difficulty of putting emotions into words and how the whole writerly process is an act of failure, because every second you realize the insufficiency of words, the inadequacy of words, how words will just taper down into emotions which are not felt, which are not rekindled, which are not remembered sufficiently. And this insufficient remembrance of emotion is exactly what gives a sense of failure, and this consuming sense of failure that Vonnegut suffers. And the same words, the opening words, appear in the chapter 2, which is the first chapter of the novel Slaughterhouse-5, and this is how it begins. Listen, Billy Pilgrim, and this is chapter 2, which should be on the screen. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. Billy has gone to sleep, a senile widower, and awakened on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. He has gone back through the door and find himself in 1963. He has seen this birth and death many times. He says and pays random visits to all the events in between. Now, what it does at a very immediate fundamental level is it talks about time traveling. So Billy Pilgrim is a time traveler, and he can connect different points of time. He can see his own death. He can come back from it. He can go back to his position of birth. He can connect to events in between. But what this kind of a time traveling does. It talks about the universal condition of war. It talks about the universal condition of horror because it connects different wars. It connects the Second World War. It connects the Vietnam War. It connects the sense of devastation, and that time traveling is also in a way to define the chronology of remembrance, the chronology of experience, the chronology of memory. So Billy Pilgrim, the narrative, the focalized persona, the persona through which the narrative is focalized, he's symbolically a time traveler, and his time traveling becomes, in a way, a defiance of the chronology of remembrance, a defiance of the compulsory chronology of remembrance. And the compulsory chronology of remembrance is something which this novel, it sort of undercuts with this postmodern playful narrative, right? So this this playfulness is interesting, but what is also immediately evident that this time traveling doesn't empower Billy; it just makes him more paralyzed, and this is what we see immediately right after. Billy is spastic in time, has no control over where he's going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He's in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he's going to have to act in next, right? So just when he began to realize that maybe time traveling is an agentic process, is an empowering process, we get to see immediately how it is not, how it's actually just the opposite. I mean, he's just an agency-less traveler in time. He's just stuck in different points of time, and he has no sense of direction. He doesn't know where he's going next. He's just pushed back and across time. And the agency-lessness of Billy Pilgrim is, in a way, the reflection of the agency-lessness of the writer, Kurt Vonnegut. So it almost becomes some kind of a writer persona. He doesn't know where he's going next. He doesn't know what he's going to talk about next. He doesn't know what he's going to remember and write next. Right? So that failure to negotiate with time, the failure to navigate time with will, with agency, becomes also part of the supposed failure of Kurt Vonnegut as a writer, to just write down and execute his writerly process through an act of remembrance. Billy was born in 1922 in Ilium, New York, the only child of a barber there. He was a funny-looking child who became a funny-looking youth, tall and weak, and shaped like a bottle of Coca-Cola. He graduated from Ilium High School in the upper third of his class and attended night sessions at the Ilium School of Optometry for one semester before being drafted for military service in the Second World War. His father died in a hunting accident during the war. So it goes. Now, you find that the sentence "so it goes" is almost like a refrain. It keeps coming as a recursive condition, and it has a sense of futility to it. It has a sense of purposelessness to it. It has a sense of lack of control. So it goes. When the narrative goes, the action goes, and there's nothing you can do as a narrator. There's nothing you can do as a storyteller. You can't control it, so it goes on its own account. Now, interestingly, we find that Billy studied optometry, the study of eyes, the medicine concerning eye, the health of eye, and that vision, the expertise in vision, symbolically speaking, becomes quite ironical over here, because Billy Pilgrim is also someone who just sees the war and the horror of the war from very close proximity. So that sense of vision, that sense of sight, becomes quite symbolic in quality, right? And then we are told Billy saw service with the infantry in Europe and was taken prisoner by the Germans. After his honorable discharge from the army in 1945, Billy again enrolled. So we were told that this sense of, he served in Europe, and then he enrolled in the Ilium School of Optometry. And this constant reference to optometry, to sight, to eyesight, to sense of vision becomes interesting and quite symbolic in the context of this story. During his senior year there, he became engaged to the daughter of the founder and owner of the school, and then suffered a mild nervous collapse. He was treated in a veterans hospital near Lake Placid, and was given shock treatments and released. He married his fiancée, finished his education, and was set up in business in Ilium by his father-in-law. Ilium is a particularly good city for optometrists because the General Forge and Foundry Company is there. Every employee is required to own a pair of safety glasses and to wear them in the areas where manufacturing is going on. GF&F has 68,000 employees in Ilium. That calls for a lot of lenses and a lot of frames. Frames are where the money is. Now, this is the interesting bit in the novel where, we're told about the backstory of Billy Pilgrim, and how this, as I mentioned, the constant reference to optometry, to vision, to study of vision, study of eyesight, becomes interesting, not least because the whole focal point in the story is Billy's eyes, Billy's eyesight, Billy's vision. And we are told that this particular line frames are where the money is. That's a very symbolic statement. So what frame are you using, what focal point are you using, determines the kind of money you are making, determines your success, determines your position of success, your achievement. And of course, it's possible to read this in a symbolic way and interpret it as an act of deframing. So what the war does, it just completely deframes your recognition of reality, it deframes the awareness of reality. And the act of deframing caused by the war, the act of defamiliarization caused by the war, is exactly what this novel is all about. And that defamiliarization, that deterritorialization, it just becomes part of the space-time disturbance, space-time discontinuity, space-time disruption that this novel does. And mind you, as I mentioned, that Billy Pilgrim's ability to travel across time is not really an ability. It's actually a form of a disability. He just has no power. He just get pushing back and across time and space. But the whole idea of him studying sight, or eyesight, or glasses becomes interesting in a symbolic way, especially in the context of the war. Okay, so we will just look at the ontology of tragedy, and what I'm more interested in this novel is looking at how this novel, Slaughterhouse-five, like Catch-22, it doesn't look at the big event model of trauma. It doesn't look at the big event model of memory, but rather it looks at a small event, the sort of the minute model, the sort of the lesser, trivial, domestic dailiness of trauma and violence. And we see that in the beginning of this novel, right at the beginning, where we are told that someone got shot because it took a teapot which was not his. And that just so domestic drama becomes a reason for death. And we have something similar over here, the death of Billy's wife, which is again an act of accident, but not a war accident, not a war trauma. And that again shows how all accidents and war, all the ontology of violence becomes sort of a connective condition around the war, and how the war accentuates it, how the war crystallizes it. So when Billy was recuperating in a hospital in Vermont, his wife died accidentally of carbon monoxide poisoning. So it goes. Now, just before that, we have the reference to Vietnam, one of the very rare references of Vietnam in the war. We are told Billy's son, Robert, had been in a lot of trouble in high school, but then joined the famous Green Berets. He straightened out, became a fine young man, and fought in Vietnam, right? So, and we are told how the Vietnam War straightened out Billy's son. And again, that's ironical in a way, because the whole idea of the Vietnam War straightening out someone is just historically untrue. And so there's this ring of irony. And right after that, as I mentioned, Billy's wife died. Early 1968, a group of optometrists, with Billy among them, chartered an airplane to fly them from Ilium to an international convention of optometrists in Montreal. The plane crashed on top of Sugarbush Mountain in Vermont. Everybody was killed by Billy. So it goes. When Billy was recuperating in a hospital in Vermont, his wife died accidentally of carbon monoxide poisoning. So it goes. So again, we can see how this "so it goes" becomes the recursive condition. And as I mentioned just a little while ago, it also becomes a pointer to the futility to control your life narratives, the futility to control your events around you. When Billy finally got home to Ilium after the airplane crash, he was quiet for a while. He had a terrible scar across the top of his skull. He didn't resume practice. He had a housekeeper. His daughter came over almost every day. And then, without any warning, Billy went to New York City and got on an all-night radio program devoted to talk. He told about having come unstuck in time. He said, too, that he had been kidnapped by a flying saucer in 1967. The saucer was from the planet of Tralfamadore. He said he was taken to Tralfamadore when he was displayed naked in a zoo. He said he was mated there with a former Earthling movie star named Montana wild hack. Now, I'll stop at this point today, and after this, I'll move on to the critical essay, because we find that this is a point in the story, in the novel, where the randomness principle, the chaos theory, begins to become more important, and it almost becomes magic realism in a very wild, violent way. And we are told that Billy has been time traveling, he has been unstuck in time, and this sort of sense of being unhinged and unstuck in time, it just becomes almost a corporeal condition. Obviously a traumatic condition, but also a position of agency-lessness. And this agency-lessness is very, very important, because he just is unhinged. And it talks about how he was kidnapped by a flying saucer, and that sounds just magical and like an alien movie. And he goes to a planet of Tralfamadore, where he's in prison, and when he is just displayed naked, he's museumized by a zoo, in a zoo, and he was mated there by a former earthly movie star named Montana Wildhack. Now, the reason why I'm choosing this is because you find that in this story, Vonnegut makes constant references to Hollywood, constant references to cinema and the popular form of representation, because the reason why that art form or that media form is referred to and sometimes parodied in some details is because the representation of Vietnam War in cinema was very different at that time. It was celebrated, it was made heroic, it was made in some kind of a noble enterprise of rescue mission, etc., which is completely the opposite of what Vonnegut is setting out to do, writing an anti-war novel. So references to cinema as an art form, as an alternative representation, becomes interesting, becomes part of the narrative strategy in Vonnegut's part, to sort of show how his novel, Slaughterhouse-5, departs from the dominant modes of representation, especially of the Vietnam War, without mentioning the war directly. There's just oblique references, as you can see. Billy Pilgrim's son presumably went to Vietnam War, and the war straightened him out. It just made him a more able man, ironically speaking. And there's a ring of irony to it, which obviously is there, especially given the anti-war context, the anti-war sentiment, the cynical, almost nihilistic sentiment that this novel displays. So I'll stop at this point today, and for the next lecture, we'll move on to the critical essay about this novel. Thank you for your attention.